Welcome to On the Books. I'm Brian Niemeier, brianniemeier.com. And we have a very special episode for you this evening. Joining me is Nebula Award nominee, multiple Hugo nominee, and Dragon Award winner for Best Science Fiction Novel, author John C. Wright. Mr. Wright, thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Pleasure to be here.
Yes, and unless I'm mistaken, terribly mistaken, you have a new book out right now.
Yes, it just came out this week. It's called City of Corpses. It's the second book in the second trilogy of my 12-volume duodecalogy called Moth and Cobweb. The trilogy is called The Dark Avenger Sidekick. The book is called City of Corpses.
Excellent. And everyone,
the only story you're going to read this year starring showgirl, ninja, elf fighters who have kidnapped fairy friends and a talking dog in New York. I think that's the only New York ninja fairy story that you're probably going to read this year.
that is a lot of strange attractors, but I think it works. I think it's brilliant. So you folks out there listening can find it in the show notes. There's a link to it down below from Castalia House. So seeing as how we have the reigning dragon of science fiction grandmaster here, I figured we would talk about science fiction.
Excellent.
But first of all, let's define our terms. What is science fiction?
That is an excellent question, and one that we could probably spend an entire show on. But I myself have come up with what I think is a nice, easy way of defining it. I think science fiction is the mythology of a scientific age. I think that all previous forms of literature have tried to encapsulate truths by means of fictions. That's what storytelling is. Storytelling is a lie that is spoken in the service of the truth. So that when Homer pens the Iliad, he actually is writing down what the nature of war is in a way that is more truthful, because it will speak more clearly to the human heart than if he just wrote down a laundry list of facts. That's the poet's job, is to look at the essence behind the facts and to just give you the concrete image of an imponderable ideal. Now, in the ancient world, before the Industrial Revolution and in the medieval world, the worldview did not have an idea that history was going to change in terms of an ongoing progress of technical or scientific improvement. The idea of improvement, the idea of progress, is a new idea. It was much more common for the ancients to believe in, for example, the Hindus believed in the wheel of time, which would turn and turn again. The Stoics, the Roman Stoics, believed that the universe would burn periodically and come back together, and it would just be an endless loop. The Christian idea was linear. It started from the creation, the fall, the redemption, the second coming, the New Jerusalem, and then the story ends. So it was like a story, not like a wheel. But even then, nothing in the book of the Apocalypse, nothing in the visions of St. John spoke about spaceships or submarines or land ironclads. But at about the time of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, and about the time of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, people became aware that the scientific method, the scientific progress, was going to change the lives of their grandkids, and they were naturally curious about it. They were naturally curious about the way they're curious about foreign countries. So the kind of traveler's tales that someone like Lemuel Gulliver might tell in Gulliver's Travels, or that Daniel Defoe might tell about a guy stranded on an island, or that Marco Polo might tell about the Far East, the kind of traveler's tales that no one could travel into the future and see, they wanted to hear about. They wanted to hear how their grandkids were going to live. And so from that, the genre was born, and is born, as most genres are, as a group of stories that had some qualities in common, some characteristics that they shared, like a family resemblance. The reason why a lot of people have such trouble defining what's inside and outside science fiction is not because we don't know where the major island in the archipelago lies. It's just that there's some outlying islands that no one's really sure if they're supposed to be part of the archipelago or if they're something else. Magical realism, horror, weird tales, fantasy, space opera, whatever, if you see what I'm saying. But the family resemblance of science fiction is, a science fiction story has to have all the elements that any other story has to have. It's got to have characters, it's got to have plot, it's got to have theme, it's got to have lyricism, it's got to have all the other storytelling elements. But there's one thing that a science fiction story has that no other type of story can ever have, which is world building and world for a science fiction or a modern fantasy story. When Homer added fantastical elements like gods and ghosts or a trip to the underworld by Odysseus, he was not making up elements that were unfamiliar to, that were new to his audience. They all knew who the gods were. They all knew who he was talking about. No one was surprised by the surprise ending of Prometheus Bound, for example. They all knew that Prometheus was going to end up stapled to a mountain in the Caucasus. But when a modern science fiction writer is writing, he's got to say in what way the new world, the next generation is going to be different from the current world. And it can be small, like in a Jules Verne type story, where the only difference is a new invention, or it can be large, like in a H.G. Wells story, where there's a time machine or a space traveling sphere that can take you to the moon, that's going to be inhabited by socialist insects. The difference between a Jules Verne type story and a H.G. Wells type story has existed from that day to this, because they're actually two slightly different subgenres. Usually Jules Verne stories are called technical SF or hard SF, and H.G. Wells stories are usually called social SF or soft SF.
Okay.
And
so
my own particular field is I basically take a fairy tale and I dress it up kind of in vaguely science fiction-y flavored props and stuff. That's what a space opera is. And you have to blow up a planet. I think that's the rule for space opera. You have to blow up at least one planet. So for example, Star Wars, space opera, they blow up a planet. The Lensman series by Doc Smith, space opera. Star Trek, I'm not sure, but I think that in the movies they blew up the planet Vulcan in one of the sequels.
Yes.
But Star Trek, I would say, is not a science fantasy or space opera the same way Star Wars is. I mean, Star Wars is you have space wizards who are attacking an evil, mysterious, horrible castle that happens to be round and as big as a moon. Anything that relies on gigantism, anything that relies on the huge issues involved, the larger-than-life characters, villains that wear black cloaks and skull masks and sound like obscene phone calls. I mean, that's what makes it a space opera. Hard SF is you try to put in a little bit of a science to give a phony feeling of verisimilitude to your hokum. Don't get me wrong, hard SF is still hokum, but it's realistic hokum. It's more realistic than soft SF or than space opera hokum.
So do you see a difference between Mill SF and space opera? There's going to be some overlap?
Very much difference. No, I say there's no overlap, and I'll tell you why. See, if you keep in mind my theory is that genres have like family resemblances to each other, so that everyone who is descended from Roger Big Nose has his big nose and is a member of his family. Well, all military SF is descended from basically Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, or, if you like, from Joe Haldeman's Forever War. Those stories were not space opera in any way, because in space opera, there's usually one guy who is larger than life, not just a hero, but a superhero, who usually has, I don't know, like a lens or a magic amulet or Jedi powers or something ridiculous that will help him throw planets around like billiard balls and smash all galaxies into each other. In the end of Skylark Duquesne by Doc E. Smith, the fourth book in his Skylarker Space series, which he started in 1939 and finished up in 1952. So it's one of the largest in time, a set of sequels that I know of. He has two entire galaxies be obliterated by teleporting a star from the first galaxy into the star from the second galaxy over and over again, millions and billions of times, so that every single star in the galaxy goes supernova.
That'll do it.
Okay, that's not Mill SF. I'm sorry. Mill SF, if you follow Starship Troopers, here's what Starship Troopers did that was unique. No other book before it had this approach. You tell the story from the point of view of a foot slogger, of a guy, a trench warrior, of a guy who's just a normal guy who is a normal grunt. Not a hero, not a king, not a knight on horseback, but just a guy holding a spear. In Starship Troopers, the reader is never even told what the causes nor the outcome of the war, because the average foot soldier would not be aware of those things. He's not a politician. Well, reasons were for why they got into the mess. He's just there to go kill the enemy and come home. Both Starship Trooper and Forever War de-emphasized heroism. If you remember, the fight scenes in those books were very abbreviated, and there was almost no personal risk on the part of the main character that was different from what everyone around him was also suffering, if that makes sense. The story was not about...
It almost told... Yeah, it was almost like a war correspondence news report, kind of objective, yes. Kind of sterile, right. Yeah.
Kind of objective, kind of sterile, because it was from the point of view of a professional soldier. Now, not all MLSF follows in that exact rut, but they do tend to have a family resemblance. They tend to de-emphasize the heroics, to emphasize the nitty-gritty of the fighting, to tell it from the point of view not necessarily of a hero or a knight, but of a CO or a grunt, a foot soldier, a sailor, a marine. Some of it is almost like film noir. It's almost like at a street level approach. But the emphasis and the appeal is usually on the realism of the military tactics involved, the military weapons involved, and the harshness of the life involved. I don't know of any military SF story where the guy floats to the battle in his spaceship filled entirely with pillows and beautiful girls, who then, while he's eating a luscious fruit, he pushes one button and his AI decides to obliterate the enemy fleet by means of shooting his black hole gun at them. That sounds nothing like a military SF story. But if the story is like the movie Aliens with an S, the second movie, that's a MIL-SF story.
Right.
Those guys are recognizable Marines. There was even a short timer, a guy who was going to get out in 2 weeks, and they had a second lieutenant in charge who was like any second lieutenant anyone in the military has ever met. And of course, the troopers are much better off when he's unconscious for most of the film. I love that movie. I should just say, because the first Aliens movie was a horror movie. If you want to talk about the difference between genres, the main emphasis there was the horror of the alien, and the main emphasis on the second one was the difficulty of the situation from the grunt's point of view. So that's my definition of a MIL-SF and why it's different, very different, I would say, from space opera. You don't meet. I mean, the soldiers meet in Star Wars. I mean, maybe you meet Dax, who is the gunner for Luke when they're trying to trip a walking tank or something. But you remember the scene where he's dueling with his father on the edge of a giant drop, where he calls out in horror when he finds out the Greek tragedy of his life. That's larger than life action.
Exactly. Yeah, the scene with the discussion between two characters, personally, I've found is one of the greatest action scenes in a sci-fi film, and it, like, not just the duel preceding it, but their discussion. Just the dramatic tension in that scene is just over the top.
It's not a very long discussion. It's only a line of dialogue or two.
Yeah.
Just now, I just heard yesterday what it was that the guy in the suit actually said. He said, because nobody knew he was going to say, "I'm your father." Nobody but George Lucas,
right,
and the actor, and of course the voice. Can't think of his name. The guy who played Simba.
James Earl Jones.
David
Prowse was in the suit.
How could I forget the name of James Earl Jones? He's got the best voice in the acting field. James Earl Jones knew what he was saying. Everyone else heard the guy in the suit, who was also saying the lines. Anthony Daniels was his name, or is it that's C-3PO?
David Prowse.
David Prowse. My mistake. My apologies. He said, "Obi-Wan Kenobi killed your father." That was the fake line, and the guy goes, "No, that's not true." Of course, but that's not really what he said. They edited that in. See, and I just thought it was brilliant.
No, yeah. Well, do we have a question?
I would have thought it was more brilliant if it had been planned out from at a time.
Yeah.
Because despite what everyone says, I do not believe that George Lucas had anything planned ahead of time. I think when he wrote the first movie, which is called Star Wars, thank you, not A New Hope, that he had no idea Luke Skywalker's dad was a brave pilot who'd been killed by Darth Vader.
Yeah, well, our good mutual friend Tom Simon,
and they certainly didn't think that they certainly did not think that Leia was his sister, because that makes everything that happens in the first two movies ridiculously creepy.
Yeah. Our good mutual friend Tom Simon wrote an essay on the Star Wars trilogy and how Lucas brought in Lee Brackett, tried Empire Strikes Back, and how she really wanted to synthesize a lot of these elements.
Yeah.
And he's not sure if it was her, or if it was Lawrence Kasdan or Irvin Kershner, because originally Anakin was still a separate guy from Vader.
Yeah.
And Luke, his ghost, and Obi-Wan's on Hoth, and the brilliant decision was the decision to combine those characters, and it brought both plot threads, just tied them together. Because originally Luke goes off to Dagobah, and then Han and Leia and the droids are on the Falcon trying to invade the Empire. And they're trying to figure out, how do we get them back together?
Yeah.
And combining Anakin and Vader just closed.
It was brilliant.
Yeah, closed the gap. Yeah.
And I can hardly think of any sequel that I thought was as good as or even better than the original. But I have to say that Empire Strikes Back is one of them. There are people who like the first movie more, but even those guys don't say the second movie is a piece of garbage. Now, on the other hand, Highlander 2, I think, is maybe the worst sequel of all time. And if you're laughing, that means you've seen it, which means your IQ is actually 10 points less than it was before you went into to see that movie.
As John C. McGinley, like, trying to do his impression of Orson Welles or something, is just, it's painful.
It was truly bad. I am Connor McLeod from the planet Zeist. I'm really glad that in the third movie and in the TV show, which I actually thought was pretty good for a spinoff, that they just forgot entirely about the planet Zeist, and they never tried to weave that into the continuity. If they had been doing Hawkman as a movie, they would have tried to reweave it into the continuity to make sense of every single possible different origin story for the character, instead of just quietly letting it die. So, but that's a whole other show. Hawkman is a show of his own.
We have a question from the chat. Getting back to world building.
Excellent.
So, is the idea not just world building, but conceptually new world building? Does there have to be a conceptually new element?
To be science fiction or fantasy?
Yeah.
I don't know what it means to be a conceptually old world if there's nothing different about our current world. So the answer is, I don't understand the question, Professor. Because if it's just a world that's like ours but not ours, I think that would technically count as science fiction, but it wouldn't give the science fiction reader what he wants out of it. If that makes sense. I mean, if you just set a story in Ruritania, like Prisoner of Zenda, but you don't make any reference to anything in the real world of our world, and you don't tie it back into our world, how is that just not a mainstream story?
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd say there has to be some speculative element for it to be world building in the first place.
So I will tentatively agree, and yet with this caveat, I was just reading William Morris's Wood Beyond the World, which is, I think, the first of the modern fantasy books. And it takes place in a world that is not our world, and yet shares our history. There's references to St. Catherine and St. Nicholas, for example. St. Nicholas, the patron saint of sailors, is mentioned by name by a sailor. There's somewhere there's a Roman Catholic Church, but the land that the main character is from is as fictional as Gilder and Florin from the movie Princess Bride, and from the book also Princess Bride. They're vaguely supposed to be kind of our world, but it's clearly a fantasy world. So I'll say that it shades into it. I'd say there's not a sharp line of demarcation, Because if you're going into the twilight world of the elves, it just gradually gets stranger and stranger the further away you go from the fields you know. But I will say that if it takes place in the here and now, and all the elements are the same as what we know here and now, it's not science fiction. You either have to take place in another world, usually the future, but not necessarily the future, or there has to be some element from the future that is intruding on our present reality, like a new invention and the implications of what that invention would be.
Yeah, I love the detail, by the way, of a sailor mentioning Saint Nicholas, or a patron of sailors. So, what I think what he was doing.
He also invented the Morris chair and wallpaper. No, he didn't invent wallpaper. He just designed wallpaper.
Oh, okay. Not close enough. So, now that we've defined science fiction, so I'm going to ask you a question that very few postmoderns
before we move on, I want to add a caveat to my definition. Okay. The reason why I call it a mythology of the modern age is because I don't think it's like a literature that is neutral when it comes to great, glorious, heavenly, and diabolical things. I think that good science fiction has to touch on certain internal concepts, which we're in a position to do better than a mainstream author, to define what it means to be human. What is man? If a mainstream author wants to answer the riddle of the Sphinx and say what a man is, you can't do what H.G. Wells does and take you to the future after man is gone and show you the Eloi and the Morlocks, who are the descendants of man, and answer the Sphinx's question from another point of view, from outside, or show you a robot, or the Tin Woodman, or show you something that is intelligent as a man but is not a man, who can show you the contrast as to what the essential elements of mankind are, or even show you what happens when a man turns into a frog or a man turns into a werewolf or something. You see, but a fantasy or science fiction story has all those options. If your main character is a human who thinks he's not a human, in a mainstream book, that guy has to be insane. There's no other option. But in a science fiction story, he could be right. He could be the robot duplicate of a guy who's dead, whose brain was recorded into his electronic brain, and who, thinks he's someone other than he is, or whatever. He could be reincarnation. He could be resurrected by the resurrection machine, or what have you. Or it could be an alien.
It could, and that segues into, what is science fiction for?
It's to entertain the customer. What is dance for? I don't know. What's poetry for? It's to remind you that there's more to life than work, sleep, and the pursuit of meaningless pleasures. It's to let you get a glimpse of life beyond the galaxy, the cosmos-sized coffin that entropy has placed around all of time-space, to ensure you that there's something beyond the fields we know, that there's something outside our little lives that is either great and terrible, great and scary, or great and glorious, or just big and explosive, being able to blow up a planet. There's many lesser side effects that science fiction, if it's done right, can also do. Hard SF can inspire people with the glamour and the romance of engineering and technology. And there's many a rocket scientist or an engineer who was turned on to it by Star Trek, by Engineer Scotty,
Mm-hmm.
Who, by the way, do you know why he was made Scott? It's because all the engineers in the 19th century were from Scotland. They had the best engineers. James Watt and the guy Maxwell, the guy who invented the 4 laws of electromagnetics. All those guys were Scotsmen. So it was a commonplace thing for an engineer to be back in the day. It was an easy shortcut for the reader for the viewer to grab onto. Soft SF. So hard SF is to inspire people to be engineers and to tell people what the romance of science is. Dystopia novels and novels about Frankenstein's monster are warning tales to tell you what might go wrong with your science, and to warn you to keep your little hands to yourself and not to go poking around in a wasp nest that you don't know what's going to happen. Most soft SF works by, soft is not a good term for this. This is, I'll say, social or psychological or political SF. they want you to explore what the ramifications of differences to our way of life might be, usually produced by a difference in technology, but not necessarily produced by a difference in technology. A.E. Van Vo's Players of Null A and Ursula K. Le Guin's Always Coming Home just had a different social structure, a different social setup, and invited the reader to speculate as to how men could live if they didn't live in a society like what we're used to. Those are meant to stimulate and exercise the imagination, and also to warn you that the future is not going to be like the past. And space opera is meant to appeal to your inner 9-year-old and to blow things up.
Of course. As like Rhea says, if something doesn't blow up every 5,000 words, he starts to get nervous. I don't know if we need to go that far, but I appreciate the principle. So another question.
5,000 and not 500? Wow.
Well, you can always turn up to 11.
Well, so, Van Vogt said that he had to put in a plot twist or a startling idea or a science fiction concept every 500 words or so. Otherwise, he would start getting nervous. He wrote roller coaster ride kind of books where you had to really cling to your seat in order to keep track with what was going on. So,
and he was actually the third of the big three, right? He was the real.
Yes, absolutely, positively. Most people these days think of the big three as Asimov, Heinlein, and Arthur C. Clarke, but in reality, Arthur C. Clarke was not a member of the John W. Campbell Jr. stable of writers. A.E. Van Vogt was the guy whose short story, The Black Destroyer, really kicked off the golden age of hard SF science fiction, which is funny because his science fiction is not hard SF at all. He rarely uses realistic or science to get to get a feeling of flavor of verisimilitude. But what he does get is the romance and the grandeur and the glory of the scientific revolution. But he's a lot more wild than Asimov or Heinlein. And I think he has not aged well, which is why that even though he was quite famous in his day, very few people know him these days. I was privileged to write a book called Null Continuum, which was the fourth book in Van Vogt's World of Null series. And I got permission of the widow, who was really the nicest woman I've ever spoken to. She was really, really kind. And
that's a coup. That's amazing.
Oh, it's I got to write my favorite book. I got to write a sequel to my favorite book by my favorite author. Even though it was the reason why I got into science fiction. It's also the reason why I got into St. John's College in Annapolis and why I got into the interest in philosophy. Because his gimmick in his story was not a new invention. His gimmick was a new science of human psychology, and so he thought that he was a fan of I.B. Korzybinski's non-Aristotelian philosophy, hence the term World of Null A. Null A is abbreviation for non-Aristotelian. And he thought that by using multi-valued logic systems, humans could become much more sane in a scientifically trained fashion, the same way we now can use building materials to make skyscrapers and airplanes and railway trains and so on and so forth. Now, I myself don't buy multi-valued logic systems in any way, shape, or form. I think that they can be reduced to convenient binary Aristotelian systems, and I don't think you're going to outsmart Aristotle. I mean, sorry, but
you don't need to apologize for that.
The romance of thinking that there was going to be a breakthrough in human psychology that would usher in a peaceful, almost utopian world was very appealing to my young mind, because the main character there overcame his foes because of his essential sanity, his essential logical, rational nature, not because he was stronger or faster or smarter. See, and that was very interesting to me when I was a kid, and very, very appealing. So I loved the chance to write this book for the estate, and I'm sorry that it was not more famous or more popular, because not that many people are even familiar with it anymore, though they still are familiar with Heinlein and Asimov.
Well, I'm curious. How did you get that writing gig? How did you get permission to?
Well, here's how it happened. Here's how it happened. I saw a notice in a trade publication of the name of the estate, and I simply wrote to them out of the blue, introduced myself, and said that I was an author who had, at that time, I had like 4 books under my belt. So I wasn't a nobody, but I wasn't a newcomer, but I wasn't big and famous. I wasn't too big and famous to make a deal with them. And I got a phone call back from the agent, and the agent gets me on the phone. And he says, "Well, I'm, because you're not a nobody, I'm willing to talk to you about this idea, but I'm a little uncertain because I don't think any modern publisher, I don't trust any modern editor to correctly edit an A.E. Van Vogt style book because he had a unique style. The only person I would trust to do it would be David Hartwell at Tor Books." And with the biggest smile I've ever smiled on my face, I said back to him, "That's my editor, and that's my publishing house. So if you're willing to make a deal with him, then we can make a deal." So while they were still negotiating the terms between them, I wrote the book.
Yeah.
in a frenzy of inspiration, and I knew, because I had been thinking about. I had read everything Van Vogt has ever written except for his true confessional stories that he wrote for magazines before he read science fiction, and his handbook on hypnosis. Basically, every other word he's ever written, I've absorbed. So I was able to write a book that had nothing of me in it and all of him. If you read my book, you're not going to read me. You're going to read him. It's just like it came out of his pen. And because of the way he writes, he left enough dangling threads and unsolved mysteries in the third book that I was able to weave together other things that also tie in other things that he's written that I knew were part of his philosophy of life. For example, I gave Enro the Red, the main baddie from the book, the violent male syndrome that Van Vogt describes in another book called The Violent Male, which was his one mainstream book. It takes place in communist China. So the negotiations went poorly for a while, but my agent, Jack Byrne, managed by dint of. The guy died, and his boss. The reason why I should say what delayed the negotiations was that the guy I talked to passed away, and his boss had to take over his work, and his boss hadn't talked to me and didn't know me, and he thought I was just some interloper that I was trying to take advantage of a poor old widow or something, and I didn't get an opportunity to prove myself to him because I basically proved myself to the agent. So my hats off and my compliments to my agent Jack Byrne, who managed to thread a very difficult negotiation shoals around the island of coming to an agreement. But everyone eventually came to an agreement, and I got the book written.
Well, and that's not Van Vogt isn't the only playground that that you've gotten to play in. He isn't the only author whose world.
I was honored to do a short story in the Jack Vance style, and I can, if I may boast, I can do a pitch perfect Jack Vance voice. In the homage volume, Songs of the Dying Earth, which was put together by George R. R. Martin and Gardner Dozois.
That's impressive.
And I was impressed. At least I was very proud of being able to sell a story to those guys, especially since the other guys in the volume are Tanith Lee and Neil Gaiman and Rob Silverberg and all the big names, all the giants of fantasy, and there's little old me among the giants. So I was exquisitely pleased with that. But just between you and me, I thought I did a better Jack Vance impersonation than they did. But excuse me, not quite. I was the only short story whose ending was not as cynical as a Jack Vance short story should have been, because he's kind of a detective writer, Vance is, and he likes his film noir kind of endings where, if you notice in a Jack Vance story, the guy almost never gets the girl, I think there's only one where he's even together with the girl at the end, and that's the Demon Prince's books. Which, if you haven't read, let me recommend.
Absolutely, I'll take that recommendation.
Have you read them or not?
I have not yet.
Read them. Read the Demon Prince's books by Jack Vance, because you will never be impressed with another supervillain again until after you see what he can do with it.
Well, that's a hook.
My wife is making comments in the background, but it's not her turn. The wife thinks they're in your genre.
All right.
The first one is called Star King.
I
The
do
second one is
enjoy
called
Space Pirate.
The second one is called The Killing Machine. The third one is called The Palace of Love. The fourth one is called The Face. The fifth one is called The Book of Dreams. And the premise is very simple. There's one survivor of the Mount Pleasant raid massacre, where a group of 5 space pirates and their men descended on a planet and destroyed it. And only a grandpa and the son survived. And the grandpa trained the grandson from age 5 or so to be a super ninja detective killing machine. His mission in life is to destroy the people who killed his entire planet. So it's Count of Monte Cristo in outer space, and it's brilliantly done.
Yeah, she's right. I have to read this now. Thanks.
William Hope Hodgson is another author that I was able to play in his background.
Yes.
The story behind that is even more complex. I had run a Nightlands role-playing game in school, and I had only ever read the first half of the book because it came out in 2 volumes from the Lynn Carter Ballantine Books imprint. So I didn't know what happened. But I made up all this additional material as to what things would have to be like on a day-by-day level, because my player characters in my D&D game were walking into the last redoubt and seeing what things looked like and how things were being run. And I ran a whole game for like half a year, so I had all this material made up for the what was surrounding the last redoubt and the other monsters, including ones that I made up myself and the ones that William Hope Hodgson had made up. And I saw a notice in a trade magazine. I started to tell the story previously, but this is the one about someone who's collecting Nightland story. And I said, aha, someone's writing stories in that background, because he's from 1912, so he's in the public domain. Anyone can write a story in Oz these days, because it's in the public domain. Anyone can write a story in the Nightlands. But I didn't know the editor, and he had a 10,000 word limit that he was going to buy. So I tried to write a short story, and it was like 30,000 words. And I said, I think I can narrow this down. So I would get it down to like 20,000 words, and I would go up every day to my little writing nook in the corner of the attic, and write furiously, and come down and tell my wife, "Dear, I've managed to get it down to 15,000 words. I think I can get it, into shape to show to Andy Robertson." She said, "Good work, dear." Then I would go upstairs and I would write, and I'd come down and say, "Dear, I've cut it down even more. Now it's 17,000 words." She would go, "That's longer, not shorter." And I would be a little confused as to this whole longer, shorter thing. And I would, a friend of mine, a guy I met at a convention, who had written a book called The High House, and his name is James Stoddard. Sweetest guy. He was a really nice guy. He just won the Compton Cook Award. And he and I fell in with each other because I had also just published my book, Last Guardian of Everness, and his house, and we both had magical houses in our books. My magic house was called Everness, and his magic house was called Evanmere. So we immediately became good friends, and we had read all the same books in our youth. So we'd read all of the Lynn Carter Ballantine fantasy series type books, and we're writing books in that style and in that genre. Well, it turns out that he knew Andy Robertson. He knew the guy who was running the website. So he said, "Well, go ahead and send your 20,000 word story." So I sent it in, and this was the most highly polished story I'd ever polished, because usually I don't rewrite my stories 10 times. Usually I write them once or twice. Well, Andy Robertson bought it and paid me top dollar. It was like 5 cents a word or something ridiculously high. Oh, I'm sorry, 10 pence a word. So I for the first story I sold him, I was able to replace my broken stove. With the second story I sold him, I was able to replace my broken refrigerator, and the third one, I think I replaced the broken microwave. So dishwasher, excuse me, below that, dishwasher. I loved telling stories to Andy Robertson. It was great. It was not until after he passed away that I saw something he had written for something else, and I don't remember the exact details, where he talked about my story, and I thought he didn't like one of the stories I wrote him. That he thought it was the most haunting and beautiful story he'd ever read in his life. And of course, I was under the impression that he just kind of thought it was okay, but he was willing to pay me for it. And he thought that I really stood out from among the other authors in his anthology because he thought they were basically like fanfic writers, and I was a pro. Well, not only was I a pro, but this story had haunted me since my school days. And I don't know if you've ever run a role-playing game, ever run a D&D game where you make up a lot more detail and background in your world, and it comes alive for you, and you fall in love with it. Okay, so this stories that I was giving him, they were works of love. I was really into them, you know. So and that came across. I think that came across in his stories. And Vox Day at Castalia House put all those stories together in an anthology, and they were connected. The stories are connected. Called the Nightlands, or Tales from the Nightlands, or Awake in the Nightlands, Awake in the Night. Oh, sorry, I can't remember the name of my own book when I'm trying to urge people to buy it. And some people say it's the best thing I've ever done, and maybe they're right, because I can't tell. I'm just the guy who does them. I don't judge. I don't try to get emotionally involved with my characters. I do my business. They do their business. Sometimes they live, sometimes not. But it's business. It's business either way.
So what are characters?
Characters are controlled split personality syndrome, where ghosts and spirits from parallel worlds come into your brain and tell you the news of what's going on in other universes. I have no idea what characters are.
Yeah.
So pick one of two. Pick one of two answers. Characters are little bits of yourself where you're trying to draw out the logic of what you would be like if you were someone else.
Mm.
And they come to life because there's a certain logic to the spirit world that we humans don't understand, but we can see it when it happens. Some characters are flat and dull and mechanical, and like, you know, all characters I write. But occasionally a good artist will inject so much life into the character that they take on a life of their own, and will even surprise the author. They'll do things and say things that the author did not expect beforehand. And those characters turn into, and if they like Hercules going from being mortal to being a god, sometimes a character takes on so much personality that he breaks out of the ordinary and everybody knows his name. Scrooge is a character like that. If you know someone who's a Scrooge, then you know exactly what he's like. Tarzan is like that. Sherlock Holmes is like that. Sherlock Holmes is the ultimate in the rational man. Tarzan is the ultimate in the noble savage. Those kind of characters take on the glow that surrounded the mythological characters, the heroes and demigods of old. That's why, if I can draw this back to the first comment, that's why I call science fiction the mythology of the scientific age. It is trying to get the science fictional view of what these mythical characters are like. I'm not sure if Tarzan counts, but he's close enough to science fiction. He's speculative, at least. He's a nearby neighbor if he's not on our main island.
Well, and he's certainly popular enough. I was reading a recent post of the Castalia House blog where it was really back in the day. There was Tarzan bread and Tarzan ice cream, and of course all the cereals and the pulps, and yeah, people today overlook just how big the pulp figures like Tarzan and the Shadow were.
The Shadow was really was big. He was in Remedium, he was in radio, he was in movies, he was in pulps, he was in comic books, and he basically set the set the stage for all of the dark, sneaky Batman-like superheroes, all the Avengers of the Night, which have come after him, in the same way that I would argue Doc Savage set the standard for all of the bright, superhuman, superhero, science hero type guys who come after him. He even had a Fortress of Solitude, just like Superman.
Yeah. So have you ever had a character, right, who just seems to come up and introduce himself, who almost seems to spring this fully formed, like Athena from Zeus's brow, if you will, that you didn't have to put any work at all into creating, just seem to pre-exist almost?
Most of them. I've been very lucky that way. Usually, my characters are spring out of role-playing games. I take Wendy and Raven were Raven, Son of Raven, was the character that I ran in my wife's role-playing game, and he was the main character of Last Guardian of Everness. And he has a lot more personality, in my opinion, than Galen Waylock, who I made up for the book. And he never quite, maybe authors should not criticize their own books, but I thought he never quite came to as much life as he wanted to. Whereas his dad, the Vietnam military vet in the wheelchair, who was the most highly decorated guy in the service at the time, he had plenty. He had bags of personality. He was from the get-go. He had his own personality, which was sad because he has a lot more. He has a lot more of a foul mouth than I do. So I can't read that book out loud to my kids because the guy was a Marine. I mean, the guy was a kick butt soldier. So
he's earthy, you know.
Yes. He was earthy. So the answer is yes. It happens to me frequently. In fact, it happens to me more frequently than it doesn't happen. Usually, if I am not having a character spring to life spontaneously, I will merely steal someone from Greek mythology, change the name, or leave the name the same, and stick them in the spot, and say, I'll get Menelaus or Agamemnon or one of those guys to step forward out of the dim mists of the past and to put on a spacesuit and act out his role in my story. That way, I don't need to make anything up.
And they're public domain, so you're okay.
That?
And they're public domain, so you're okay.
Well, not only are they public domain, but you can't copyright personality types anyway. If you want to have a dark, mysterious Avenger, you don't have to pay Bill Finger or Maxwell Grant anything for for the Shadow or for Batman. Just his winged vengeance. That's what I did in my last book.
Yeah.
Of course, I gave. But here's the other thing that I do. I collide two or more personalities together. So I'll take someone like Hermes, which is an archetypical personality type. You know that Hermes is the prince of lawyers. He's going to be fast. He's going to be clever. He's going to be cunning. He is the guy who has enough rope to hang himself with. And you mix him with someone else, Brand of Amber or something. Or you make him halfway between that and Thomas Edison, and he becomes a different kind of guy. Say, does that make sense? What I'm saying? And so the resulting vector of the collision of the two different personality archetypes will get you a new personality that's not just a cheap knockoff copy of someone else's work. It's a cheap knockoff copy. It's two people's work, but it'll fool the reader. They'll think it's real. It'll fool you too. The people come to life when you do that kind of thing. It's been overdone in the comics, but in books, if you swap the sex of an archetypal character, sometimes you get an interesting side effect. Like Batgirl doesn't have the same personality as Batman, for example.
Mm-hmm. Can the
answer is yes.
I know this is okay.
Go ahead. No, ask anyway.
So that's all the time we have. No, I'm kidding. We can go on as long as you want. But can a bad person write good science fiction? Is there some sort of moral uprightness requirement?
I certainly hope not. Otherwise, I'd be disqualified.
Same here.
I'm a supernaturalist. I don't think the material world is all that there is. I believe that most writers, most poets, open themselves up to divine madness, and that the gods come down and give them ideas, and that we're just the donkeys that are carrying the the mailman on our back, and the mailman is not the one who writes the letter. He's merely the one who carries it. So when I write a book and I hand it to the reader, I'm in the position of the guy who the letter comes from the muses. The letter comes from that mysterious whatever it is, where ideas come from, and no one knows where that is. Harlan Ellison thinks it's Schenectady, and I'm not going to argue with a man as creative as Harlan Ellison. But wherever it is, it's an unknown. My personal personality will influence the water passing through the channel of my brain, but and I might give it some flavoring, so that if I write the story of the Count of Monte Cristo in space, it's not going to be the same as if Jack Vance writes it. It's not going to be the same as if A. Van Vogt writes it. And it's not going to be the same as if Bob Hyland writes it. See?
Right.
But I don't think it's coming from me. I think all I'm doing is providing the conduit, providing the introduction. The ideas then go into the reader, and they are planted like a seed in the soil of his imagination. And then what springs out and what he enjoys, the fruits of that, is only half me, or I should say half the story, and the other half is him. That's why readers' reactions to your stories are unexpected and can be a lot deeper than you expect. Now, I should say, let me see if I can explain that more clearly. On a shallow level, when I, for example, go to see the movie Dark City, and I see floating guys wearing fedora hats who look like a German expressionist movie, and it reminds me of a Van Vogt story I read, and it reminds me of a Keith Lemire book that I really liked, and it reminds me of a black and white silent movie that I really liked, that makes me really positively react to what I'm seeing, that other people in the room with different backgrounds are not going to feel, though they may also still react positively to the storyline of a man in a kind of a Gnostic world of evil, trying to find the truth buried under layers of false memories, false appearances, and false fronts. The archetypical stories, the deep stories that speak to many men, they're getting their ideas from the layer of the universe where the really big ideas live, the ones that are universal. Love and death, good and evil, leadership and following, fate and free will, all the big questions. The ones that are shallower, that are only going to appeal to a more limited audience. If I write a story about George Washington, it's probably only going to appeal to Americans, for example. Or if I write a story about a railroad executive, it's probably only going to appeal to devoted libertarian capitalists, especially if I read it like Ayn Rand, which I can't do, but I wish I could, but I can't. And some stories like, I don't know. Some stories are so limited in their appeal that they're not going to get much of an audience, and they're just too personal, if that makes sense. And I think that an author who's doing that kind of work isn't really paying attention to his proper calling. He's not listening to the muses. He's not listening to the mysterious gods that give people ideas. Because every human story should have some universal element to it. That's why we can read stories from cultures not our own. That's why I can read Homer, who was a pagan living in the Bronze Age, with perfect enjoyment, because the things that he and I share in common are still deep and abiding. The concept that you're not allowed to write stories in other people's cultures but your own, and not allowed to read stories except that star people who look exactly like you and have your same race and sex and sexual preferences, that comes from hell. That is a satanic idea, and the only purpose of that idea is to drive away the creative spirit and to make it so that you are unsympathetic with people who are unlike you, rather than able to see what you and that other person have in common that makes you brothers. The best way to learn brotherhood with anyone is to read the story from his point of view and walk a mile in his shoes. And that's one thing that all writers, not just science fiction writers, are supposed to do.
Here, yeah. I mean, you and I are both Christian, and when we say that the purpose of fantasy and science fiction is to lie in service of the truth. You know, we believe that the divine logos, incarnate the person of Jesus Christ, is the truth. For us, truth is a person.
Yeah, truth is a guy. He was talking to Pontius Pilate, who said, "What is truth?" And Pontius Pilate didn't realize who he was talking to. But you and I live in a Pontius Pilate age. The world around us these days, Pontius Pilate's cynicism and limited imagination has become popular, has become the default assumption of the world. In my daddy's time, in my granddad's time, it was not that way. The Christian assumption in those days was the default assumption of the Western world, of the United States.
Jeffrey Johnson talks about in Appendix N about how they're, in the pulp era, there's science fiction stories about astronauts who visit new worlds, and they're like, all right, there are intelligent beings here. We need to convert them to worship Jesus Christ.
Specifically, that was from Pellucidar. That was from Edgar Rice Burroughs' David Innes, who gets in a broken mole machine and winds up in the inside of the interior hollow world, which of course is inhabited entirely by gorgeous cave girls, brutal warriors, and mind-reading birds and dinosaurs. So that was back when people took their awesome sauce straight.
Yeah, but at the same time, coming from the Christian assumptions about the world, that doesn't mean that we just dismiss anything written by pagans or heathens out of hand. Paul says, test everything, retain what's good. And because of the universality of mankind, there's one human nature. We're, guys like Aristotle are gonna get things right. Just not only
do I agree, but at the risk of turning this into the Christian hour, let me say this: I've never seen any other culture that paid attention to any other culture besides itself, aside from Christendom. The Christians wrote down and kept Aristotle alive. The Romans did not even bother to write down the, at that time, living language of the hieroglyphs to allow them to translate what was written on the walls in Egypt, which they ruled. That makes sense? There was no science of anthropology among the pagans. There was no curiosity about Egyptian history among the Romans, among the Greeks. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Only the Christians go, I'd like to find out what the mythology of those people is. I'd like to find out who the gods are that they worship and write their stories down before they're eliminated. The Muslims, they blow up ancient statues of Buddhas and so on and so forth. They burn books, not us. Now, the enemies, the leftist enemies of Christ always pretend that we do the things that our deadly enemies do, and that's just an old trick. They just reverse the values of any equation in order to get the opposite value from the real value. They just assume we act like Islamics and treat our women as badly as they do, and so on and so forth, because they want to hate us, and they couldn't do that if they knew what we were really like. But the reason why I think that drawing it back to the original question, I think science fiction is uniquely Christian in its approach, because a science fiction story is a scientific romance. A romance story is a story about man's relation to the universe, told from the point of view of the individual merit or the individual demerit of the hero. The stories of the pagans didn't quite have that same flavor of romance. Romance actually came out of the Middle Ages and out of the Renaissance. The epic adventures in the quest of knights and ladies, or Canterbury Tales, which wasn't just knights and ladies, but also, the the wife of Bath and the miller and the nun's priest and so on and so forth. Common men and high and low were also included in that book. Well, Beowulf is a very interesting artifact, because it is a Christian. Scholars have disagreed in their opinions as to what's going on. My opinion is that a Christian was writing down what his pagan ancestors were like, and he did not want to treat them with disrespect. But he does mention things like, in passing, human sacrifice and that they're damned. But he shows their brilliance and their glory, but also the essential melancholy and sorrow of the pagan worldview. If you read the Greek myths, those do not have happy endings. I don't think it's until like the story of Psyche and Cupid, late Roman, that you have happy endings for for Greek myths. Maybe you could argue that the Odyssey, Odysseus gets back home again and kills the suitors and gets his wife again, has a happy ending. But it's like they have more in common with film noir movies than they do with anything else. So next time you're reading about the stories of Odysseus, I want you to imagine that it's Humphrey Bogart in black and white, and that Calypso is a sultry dame who's trying to lure him to his destruction or something. There's a femme
I have a
fatale.
choice now. Pop in there.
Well, there's a lot of women in those film noir detective books that are just like Circe. They're witches who just lure you in, they turn you into pigs. I mean, metaphorically speaking.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll even go one better, and I totally agree with what you said. But not only the fantastical element, but the scientific element. And let's not forget that the church invented the scientific method.
Yeah.
Science was stillborn everywhere else. Other cultures came up with they had geniuses who in isolation would come up with
an invention,
leaps,
but not with the scientific progress. Our Mike Flynn, the science fiction writer, who I assume you know because he's good, and he wrote Evilheim, and he wrote In the Country of the Blind.
I'm familiar with TUF, yes. Yes.
And so he wrote a long series of articles about the relationship of the church and to the growth of science. And I myself, whenever someone tries to argue the point with me, merely start listing the number of scientists who started their own scientific school of thought, like the father of geology, the father of the Big Bang Theory, the father of genetics, and the father of of modern astronomy. But I limit myself only to churchmen, only to priests and monks. As soon as the guy drops dead from boredom after I've hit the 100th or 200th person on the list, I don't feel it's necessary to argue the point. I do occasionally point out that when a culture in the West has rejected Christianity, as the Nazis did and as the communists did in Russia, that what happens then is science goes off the rails. The Nazis had brilliant technology, but they believed in a racial science that was merely junk science. It was merely garbage. And in Russia, Lysenko was made the minister of the scientific whatchamacallit in Russia, and he would just jail people that disagreed with the scientific theories. He said that evolution was a bourgeois theory because in real life, groups cooperated for the sake of the class struggle the same way they do among men, and that Darwin was too individualistic for him, and so he thought he could change the characteristics of growing plants without paying attention to the genetics, merely by introducing the elements of the materialist dialectic from Marx. And of course, that is one of the many things that led into the Ukrainian famine. And what I like is that intellectuals in that school of thought and in that tradition who have taken over universities to this day never pay the price for that, never issue an apology for that, never even seem to be aware that it's happened. So without the Christian worldview, it is difficult to understand why science should work. Because if I was just a materialist and I would say, I'm merely one animal among many, my brain was created by a natural process that was organized but not intentional, not directional. Why would I think that my brain processes have any necessary fundamental relationship with the natural processes? Why would I think the laws of logic in my mind and the laws of nature in reality, in the material world, have a one-to-one correspondence? Why should math work to describe the motions of the planets and the motions of the atoms? A Christian can answer that question quite easily, but outside of that, unfortunately, science, the empirical sciences, is based on metaphysical assumptions that science itself cannot confirm or deny. And so you need to have a deeper worldview than the scientific worldview to have the scientific worldview. Does that make sense? You need to have the axioms. You need to have the foundations of the tower in order to have the tower. And the tower itself cannot serve as its own foundation because no one can, you can't stand on your own head.
Yeah. And one definition of metaphysics is the stuff you need to know before you can do physics.
Right.
Which is prior to or
that That would be Aristotle's definition, and you and I previously said you're not going to outsmart. You're not going to outsmart Aristotle. One drawback of the scientific age is, of course, that people who are drunk with progress tend to dismiss anything that happened in the past as if it's going to be superseded. This, I think, is based on a misreading of Darwin's Origin of Species, and it springs out of Hegel and Marx and Nietzsche and other, if you'll pardon the expression, crackpots who didn't seem really to understand what philosophy was supposed to be doing, and wrote a bunch of stuff that people read in philosophy class, but which I would not count as real philosophy.
Agreed. Well, we have been at this for over an hour in the show. Normally runs 10 or 15 minutes, but I just couldn't restrain this conversation. It was so fascinating. But before we go, we wandered
pretty far afield. Do you want to have any last questions about science fiction? We didn't even discuss how the difference between science fiction and modern fantasy.
Well, we'll have you back, definitely.
Do I get to give an ad for my latest and greatest book, or was what I just said already sufficient?
No, yes, you do. Go ahead.
City of Corpses is the second book in the trilogy. The first book is a girl who's forgotten her own name and her own past wakes up in a hospital room and is attacked by werewolves and goat-headed monsters from Celtic mythology. She discovers to her surprise that she is highly skilled and trained in martial arts, and finds out when she's flung out a window that she has a magical ability to float rather than fall. But that ability has a certain drawback, because evil creatures come out of the shadows whenever she uses it. She doesn't know where she's from or where she's going or what's going on in life. So she's kind of like you and me in that respect. But she can see things other people can't see and do things other people can't do. So she's like Jack Burton from Big Trouble in China in that respect. And in the second book, she gets a job at the Cobbler Club, which is she's learned enough to know that there's a conspiracy going on and that there's a secret war between a group called the Supreme Anarchist Council, which for some reason is a highly organized group of anarchists, go figure, and a group called the Last Crusade, which apparently consists of 2, maybe 3 teenage boys who are the world's only hope against the Supreme Anarchist Council. All of mankind is under the spell known as the Black Spell of Everness, where they're not able to be aware of or to remember the supernatural creatures that are ruling us, that are ruling mankind and taking advantage of us. The anarchists want to overthrow that system, which you would think would be a good thing, but they don't want to free mankind afterwards. And so she knows that this nightclub is like a neutral ground where the factions from the various fairy worlds and human worlds can meet, because there's 3. The humans are the people of the daylight world, and the half-breeds, who are half fairy, half human, are from the twilight, and they don't really belong to either world. And the elves are from the night world. And there is a darkness beyond the night, which maybe which plays a role in the plot. So humorous, half adventure, half girl worrying about the guy she's in love with because she's a girl, and she has to carefully follow the threads of the clues she has had to discover who she is and what she's doing, because as best she can tell, she's a superhero and sidekick to a guy called Winged Vengeance, who as she finds out from friends of hers, he leaves people, after torturing them into signing confessions, he leaves them hanging by the neck in Central Park. And the humans can't see his victims, but the elves and the half-humans can. And he's out for vengeance, hence his name. So
it sounds like the English translation of some classical Greek statue or something, and I love it.
Oh no, she's Japanese, and most of the mojo that she uses comes from Japanese mythology, because she's from an Oriental branch of the family. She's a moth, I should say. It should be no surprise, as are the other major characters in the other 12 books. The idea there is that the moth family is a family of the twilight. They have some fairy blood in them, so they have the second sight, and they're poets and madmen and magicians and people with weirdness are hanging around them. But they always help each other, even when the day and the night are against them. So she's kind of a unique case, because with her memory loss, she's been cut off from any family support, and she doesn't know which side they're on or that she's on, if you see what I'm saying. So she's got to find out everything about herself before she knows what's going on. But she does know that she's in love, and that the guy asked her to marry him or marry her, and she doesn't know who it is. and if you know any women, you would know that women find that kind of thing very very annoying. So just to find him again before he gets eaten by sold to hell or something. Something terrible is going to happen to him.
Right,
she doesn't know whether he's alive or dead.
That is my book 5, City of Corpses. I'm just
that's book
the promo for your book. Yeah, available now for
the promo. Yeah, that was supposed to be the promo. It's a book about a girl who's annoyed, who can karate chop her hand through a werewolf skull. No, excuse me. What, say again?
And has
yes, she's got feather
falls and at will. Yeah.
Well, that's why I wanted to have an explanation as to why she could swing like Spider-Man or fly like Batman Beyond. I mean, the glider one from the future. I don't know if you ever saw that cartoon.
Oh yeah, Terry McGinnis, absolutely.
Yeah. So she got like a Terry McGinnis suit, but she wears the mask is a Japanese no mask of a fox spirit, a kitsune. So her super name is a fox maiden. And everyone who sees her thinks that she's still working for the guy, the vengeance crazy guy, and she's not, so. Oh, the talking dog Ruff makes an appearance in this book.
Yes.
Oh no, excuse me. He makes an appearance. He makes an appearance in the next book. I had to move that scene.
Oh.
Oh no, he is in this book, but only Gil can understand what he's saying. So it's like listening to Luke Skywalker talk to C-3PO. He's still funny though, even though you can't understand a word he's saying. He's the only one who figures out who the not to like Han and Chewie. But not to spoil the big surprise, I should mention Ruff is the guy who figures out who the girl is.
All right, I definitely don't want to spoil it for readers.
No.
If you're not convinced, folks, if you're not convinced to pick up Moth and Cobweb 5, City of Corpses now, I don't know what will. You can get it at the link below. Also, be sure to check out John C. Wright's journal. We've got a link to that. And then my own humble offerings in the Soul Cycle. My whole series is currently on sale for less than $9 in the third book, Secret Kings, edited by Mr. Wright's lovely and talented wife, El Gigi Lamplighter Wright. It's currently 99 cents for 3 more days.
I'll also mention that I'm doing an ongoing weekly pulp adventure story called Lost on the Last Continent, which you can see at my website once a week. It has a new episode each week. And the sequel to City of Corpses called Ties to Tartarus is written. It's sitting on the editor's desk, and it's going to come out later on this year. So that book is already written. So all the plot threads are all tied up, and the ending is already done. Okay?
Beautiful. Well. Yeah.
And
well, John,
my Tor book comes out this winter. Count to Infinity comes out this winter from Tor Books.
Can't forget that. But yeah, thank you. It has been a delight and an unmixed pleasure to have you. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Quite welcome.
And this has been on the books.
If I could remember what it is that you're grateful for that I did for you as a favor, then I'd feel glad, but I can't. So I just assumed that it was actually my wife who did it and didn't tell me. But I'm happy to help. I'm happy to help you out with your career if I can.
Well, much appreciated.
Certainly. We Godbothers have to stick up for each other, otherwise the seculars will undermine us and destroy our careers.
Well, they will know we are Christians by our love. So this has been Geek Gab.
Are you sure? Because I was hoping it was by our snark, because otherwise I'm hosed, because I can't really No,
Oh, we don't
I
have
didn't
to-
realize. I didn't realize I was signing up for such a difficult religion. Why can't I just have one where I get to kill people in the name of Odin or something, and get 72 virgins when I die? What's this difficult stuff?
It's the easiest and the hardest thing you'll ever do.
It is, because of course you get help. I mean, you get aid from on high. Sorry, I didn't mean to get all theological again, but God bless you, sir.
God bless you. It's fine. I'm a theologian. Absolvo te.
I don't know how to say. I don't know how to say I talk too much in Latin, but mia loquicius maxima. So we can say good night there. Good night, Gracie.
Good night, everybody. So also, that Orpik will kill me if I don't remember to say subscribe. Click the button below, but then also you've got a double secret subscribe by clicking the little bell icon, or you won't get the notifications of a new show, which we try to do every Wednesday, usually around 5 Eastern, but more than happy to make an exception this week for our special guest. This has been On the Books. Special guest, John C. Wright. Thanks again to him. Thanks for everyone at home for listening, and keep reading.